The gentle afternoon breeze swayed the leaves of the century-old oak that Caleb watched through the window of the small trailer where he lived. It was not a luxurious place, but it was his refuge, a space he had built with his own hands after years of battling his internal demons. At 37, his face already bore marks of an intense life. Deep honey-coloured eyes inherited from his mother, but with premature wrinkles around them, the result of sleepless nights and days lived on the edge. That morning he tried to adjust the tie in front of the cracked mirror, but his rough fingers, marked by hard work in the workshop, seemed unfamiliar with the touch of the light and formal fabric. It was not something he wore frequently. The news of his father's death had hit as a dry blow straight to the chest. Henry Miller, at 72, had succumbed to leukemia in just a few weeks. Too quick for goodbyes, too abrupt for reconciliations. Between them there had been a void, a dense silence, full of swallowed words and gestures never made, that now, with death, became definitive. Caleb had grown up in a house where rules were clear as crystal. Henry, a decorated veteran who had returned home with more honours than words, was a man of rigid principles and few displays of affection. "A real man stays silent," he used to say, while adjusting his military posture even at the dinner table in the rare moments when the family gathered. Thomas, the firstborn, followed the expected path. Brilliant from a young age, with exemplary grades and impeccable behaviour, he graduated in medicine from an elite university, completed his residency with distinction, and married Catherine, the daughter of a respected judge. Every Sunday, he appeared at his parents' house with his wife and two perfectly dressed children, a living demonstration of what it meant to do everything right. Rebecca, 3 years younger than Thomas, was also a source of pride. Intelligent and determined, she built a solid career in the banking sector. She started as an intern, and in less than 10 years held an executive position. Her elegant apartment in the city centre and her imported car were symbols of the success Henry so cherished. Then came Caleb, the youngest, the different one, the one who never fit in. Since childhood, Caleb felt everything too intensely. He would cry when he saw an injured animal, explode with frustration when he couldn't fix something, and laugh too loudly during the rare times when something amused him in the heavy atmosphere of the Miller household. Too sensitive for his own good, his mother Martha said in rare moments of confidence, her gaze always split between worry and an affection she never knew how to express adequately. At 16, he discovered that the numbing sensation of alcohol dulled the pain of not fitting in. At 19, after driving drunk and crashing into a tree, he spent his first night in jail. Henry did not show up to pick him up. It was Thomas who paid the bail, with a look of disappointment that hurt more than any words. After dropping out of 2 college courses, Caleb was no longer mentioned at Sunday dinners. He slept on friends' couches for almost 2 years, trading temporary jobs for nights of drinking and, eventually, harder drugs. He slept in shelters when no couches were available, spent nights in train stations when even the shelters wouldn't take him. "A lost burden," Thomas once declared when the mother tried to mention Caleb's name during a birthday. The phrase sealed the fate of the youngest of the Millers. He became a ghost in his own family. But something in Caleb, perhaps the same intensity that had destroyed him, also saved him. At 30, after a particularly brutal night where he barely survived an overdose, he used the little money he had to admit himself to a modest rehabilitation clinic on the outskirts of the city. It was not a sophisticated place, nothing compared to the private clinics that Thomas could recommend, but it was there, among peeling walls and sincere therapy groups, that Caleb finally faced his demons. He came out clean, determined, alone but for the first time feeling strong in his solitude. He found a job in a small auto repair shop. Since childhood, he had a fascination for cars, for the parts that fit together perfectly to create movement, for the possibility of fixing something broken. He started by washing cars, then helping with simple tasks. With patience, something he had learned in recovery, he became an excellent mechanic. The smell of oil and grease on his hands brought him a satisfaction that no drug had ever provided. Gradually, he began to attend support meetings for substance dependents. He didn't speak much. In that way, perhaps he was similar to his father, but his silent presence and story of rebuilding inspired others. On Saturday mornings, he volunteered to teach basic mechanics to young people in recovery, demonstrating that hands once shaking in search of drugs could create, repair, transform. He remained sober for 7 years. His trailer was simple but clean and organized. He had a small collection of books on mechanics, some plants he tended with meticulous care, and an old photograph, him at 7 years old, smiling next to a car his father was fixing. It was the only picture of Henry he kept. When he learned of his father's illness, fear and pride paralyzed him. He tried to visit, but always found excuses to delay. Until one day, he finally summoned the courage. The hospital room was cold and impersonal. Henry was asleep, connected to machines beeping at regular intervals. His body, once robust and imposing, seemed to have shrunk, weakened by illness. Caleb stood by the bedside for half an hour, watching his father breathe with difficulty. He wanted to hold his hand, to say he missed him, to say he had changed, to hope he was proud now. But the words stayed trapped in his throat, as they always did in Henry's presence. He left the hospital without saying anything. 3 days later, he received a call from Bernice, the housekeeper who had been working for the Millers for more than 30 years. "Your father passed away this morning, Caleb. The funeral will be tomorrow at 10. At the funeral, Caleb wore the only dress shirt he owned, slightly faded at the sleeves from so much washing. He sat in the back row of the church, away from the rest of the family that occupied the front pews. Thomas gave an eloquent speech about honor, dedication, and legacy. His mother and Rebecca remained upright, composed, their faces like masks revealing no emotion, a skill Caleb never developed. Bernice, in her impeccably black uniform, approached and sat next to him. Silently, she squeezed his hand tightly, like someone holding on to something precious that could slip away at any moment. Caleb did not cry, but his eyes were red and burning, filled with tears that refused to fall, a pressure in his chest that seemed about to explode. 2 days later, he drove to the old family home for the reading of the will. His old Honda stopped in front of the imposing residence where he had grown up. The garden was meticulously maintained, with the same military precision that Henry had kept throughout his life, even when his hands trembled too much to hold the gardening tools. The house seemed frozen in time. Only the silence was denser, more definitive. The meeting took place in the library. A middle-aged woman with grey hair and square glasses introduced herself as the attorney in charge of Henry's will. Thomas sat rigidly in a leather armchair, Catherine by his side. Rebecca occupied the sofa with their mother, who seemed to have aged 10 years since the funeral. The reading was quick and formal. Thomas would inherit the family business, a small but profitable medical supply company that Henry had built after his military career. Rebecca would receive the house and a considerable bank account. The grandchildren were granted generous educational funds. Caleb's name was not mentioned. No phrase, no explanation, no acknowledgement of his existence. He smiled. A small, bitter, almost imperceptible smile. He was already used to not being seen, to not being part of it, to settling for leftovers. And now there wasn't even that. The lawyer, noticing his discomfort, clinically explained, "The will was registered 6 years ago. Henry never sought to update it. It is valid and incontestable." Caleb just nodded. 6 years ago, he still represented a shame for the family. He lived in a borrowed basement, exchanging his few belongings for drugs. He was not someone who inspired confidence, he knew. His father did that in a moment of anger, of deep disappointment. And then time simply passed. He slipped out the back door while the others were discussing bureaucratic details. In the hallway leading to the kitchen, he found Bernice, standing with her arms crossed, in the same way she did when he was a child trying to steal cookies before dinner. "He asked me to give this to you," she said. extending an old coverless book with edges stained and worn by time. Caleb recognized the book immediately. It was the only one his father had read to him just once, when he was 9 years old and had a high fever. An almost forgotten memory, like a distant dream, but one that had remained tucked away in some corner of his mind. The Old Man and the Sea, by Hemingway. A story about persistence, failure, and dignity. A book? Caleb raised his eyebrows, confused. Check the last page, replied Bernice, with an enigmatic spark in her tired eyes. With slightly trembling fingers, Caleb slowly flipped through until he found a letter taped with aged adhesive on the last page of the book. The handwriting was unmistakable, square and firm. Henry's handwriting. Caleb, I made choices I regret. Anger at seeing you sink. Anger at not knowing how to reach you. I hope you like this gift. The key is with Bernice. Father. Caleb looked at Bernice, confusion etched across his face. She just nodded, as if confirming an unasked question, and pulled a key with a simple leather keychain from the pocket of her apron. She placed it in his hand gently, as if handing over something sacred. He bought the land and a shed 6 months ago. Started setting up a workshop for you. Bought tools, had everything installed, painted the walls. He said one day he would call you, make a surprise, but he got sick, and too quickly. Why didn't you tell me? Caleb murmured, his voice faltering, a knot forming in his throat. Because Henry didn't know how to apologize, she replied, with the wisdom of someone who had known the man for decades. Not even when he wanted to. Bernice told him that Henry never had the courage to get close to his son, but from afar, he silently followed him. He knew where he worked as a mechanic and was aware of small details of his routine. In a surge of contained affection, he decided to give him a gift. Caleb was left speechless. A flood of emotions overwhelmed his chest, and he spent the night sleepless, thinking about everything, about the unspoken words. The next morning, Caleb drove to the address written on the letter. It was a remote industrial area, with small warehouses and workshops lined up on wide streets. The building was simple, with grey walls and a discreet facade. As he turned the key in the lock and opened the door, he felt something strange forming in his chest, a mixture of longing, anger, and a strange form of love that he had never known how to name. The workshop was fully equipped. Workbenches meticulously organized, tools lined up like in a catalogue, boxes of labelled parts, new uniforms hanging in an iron cabinet. On a desk in the corner, he found a folder with documents, deed, licenses, paid bills, all in his name. In the far corner there was a framed photograph, the same one he kept in his trailer, only larger, restored, and protected by glass. It was him and his father, in that old moment. Caleb at 7 years old, dirty with grease, with a crooked smile of childlike satisfaction. Henry in the background, looking at him with an expression Caleb had never noticed before. A subtle, restrained pride, the kind that had never been verbalized during his lifetime. Caleb sat on the cold floor of the workshop. Silence enveloped him like a heavy blanket. He stayed there for hours, listening to the echo of his own thoughts, the painful and sweet memories intertwining. For the first time he understood that his father had tried to reach out to him. Not in the right way, perhaps too late, but he had tried. It made him cry, tears came uncontrollably. The workshop was not just a material inheritance, it was a silent apology, a belated acknowledgement. An I see you that was never spoken aloud. It was Henry's way, without words, without fanfare, without celebration, a gesture when words failed. In the following weeks, Caleb dedicated himself to preparing the workshop for opening. He cleaned every corner, organized every tool, checked every piece of equipment. On the day of the inauguration, he hung a simple but carefully made sign, Miller and Son Workshop. Thomas appeared in the late afternoon, out of place in his expensive suit, looking around with a mix of surprise and something that seemed like reluctant admiration. "He never told me about this," he said, hands in his pockets, avoiding his brother's gaze. "He didn't tell anyone," Caleb replied, wiping his hands on a cloth. That was his way. The two remained silent for a moment, decades of distance between them. "It's a good place," Thomas finally spoke, extending his hand in a formal gesture. "Father would be proud." Caleb accepted the handshake, feeling a crack begin to form in the wall that separated them. It wasn't forgiveness yet, nor complete reconciliation, but it was a beginning. As the months passed, the workshop gained a regular clientele. Caleb became known for his meticulous and honest work. On Saturdays, he opened the doors to young people in recovery, teaching them not only mechanics, but also offering a space where they could rebuild confidence in themselves, just as he once did. On a quiet afternoon, while adjusting the engine of an old car, Caleb looked at the photograph of his father that he kept on the wall. He finally understood that Henry had given him more than a workshop. He had given him a chance to start over, to heal, to build something lasting from the broken fragments. And this, Caleb realized, was the true inheritance. The understanding that not every apology comes with words. Sometimes it comes with a key, a chance, an open door to something new, and it is up to us to have the courage to walk through it. That night, as he closed the workshop, Caleb paused for a moment to look at the sign, "Miller and Son," illuminated under the dim streetlight. He smiled, not the bitter smile of the funeral, but a smile of peace, of someone who had finally found his place. The place that his father, in his complex silence, had helped to build for him. If you enjoyed the story, please leave a comment with a rating from 1 to 5 to show how much you liked it. Also, watch the video that is now appearing on your screen. See you soon.